By midnight, the Kane estate on the banks of the Mississippi looked like something carved out of a dream, its marble floors polished to a mirror shine, its crystal chandeliers pouring gold light over 300 of the most powerful people in New Orleans, all of them lifting champagne to toast the engagement of a man nobody dared to cross. Rafferty Kane stood at the heart of it, a man in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered in a black suit with no tie, his dark hair already silvering at the temples, a faint scar tracing his jaw, and eyes the cold gray of river water in the dead of winter. Men who ran half the city lowered their voices whenever he spoke, but there was one woman under that roof he'd never once noticed, at least not yet. Fay Delacroix was slight, in her late 20s, with chestnut hair pinned low and pale gray eyes that had learned long ago how to stay quiet. She wasn't a guest. She carried the trays, refilled the glasses, and smiled at strangers who never once looked her in the face. What none of them knew was that she'd taken this shift for a single reason, because tonight the tips would decide whether her little girl finally got the surgery she'd been promised. And what nobody in that glittering ballroom could have guessed was that Rafferty's bride-to-be, the beautiful Celeste Vanterpool with her platinum hair and her honeyed voice, was about to force this tired young mother down onto the cold marble floor and keep her there until the most dangerous man in Louisiana finally walked past and saw her. By the time the sun rose, everything these people believed about power, about loyalty, about who truly mattered inside that house, would be turned completely upside down, and the woman they'd all overlooked would leave a mark on that man's heart that 25 years and an entire fortune had never once been able to touch. If a story about quiet dignity and second chances is something you believe in, take a moment and tap that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way back home. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to that marble hallway, where a mother is about to be brought to her knees, and a powerful man is about to remember who he used to be. Many hours before those crystal chandeliers were lit, while the city still lay half asleep beneath the thin veil of mist rising from the river, Fay Delacroix woke in the small apartment on the top floor of an aging building, where the sound of water dripping through the pipes was more familiar than the ringing of an alarm clock. Early sunlight slipped through the faded curtains and cast a pale golden streak across the worn wooden floor. And in the middle of that slender beam, her little daughter sat cross-legged, her hair still tousled with sleep, her round eyes brightening the moment she saw her mother approaching. Josephine, whom Fay always called by the affectionate name Josie, had only just turned 5, and to the little girl, every morning spent beside her mother was a treasure beyond measure. On the low table in the center of the room lay a stack of colored paper that Fay had carefully saved enough money to buy the week before, the only small gift she could afford at the moment. And Josie was waiting for her mother to join her in the game they loved more than any other. Fay sat down beside her daughter, picked up a sheet of blue paper, folded it carefully in half, and ran her finger firmly along the crease to make it sharp. She moved slowly so Josie could follow each gesture, folding one corner, turning another edge, until a tiny boat appeared in the palm of her hand. Josie cried out with a sound that wasn't perfectly formed or clearly spoken, yet overflowed with pure delight, her tiny hands clapping together before she reached out and asked to fold one of her own. Her folds were still clumsy and uneven, one end of the boat rising higher than the other, but Fay cradled it as though it were the most beautiful treasure in the world, placing the two boats side by side on the table and telling her daughter that they were about to set sail together. Whenever Fay spoke, Josie did what she had always done, lifting one small hand and resting it gently against her mother's cheek. Her ears couldn't fully hear the world around her, and one had been almost completely silent since birth, so the little girl had discovered her own way of listening to her mother by feeling the vibrations of Fay's voice beneath her palm, warm and steady like the beating of a heart. Fay spoke very softly, telling her a gentle bedtime tale about their tiny blue vessel embarking on a grand adventure. And beneath those tender little fingertips, Josie smiled, feeling every word even though she couldn't clearly hear a single one. Moments like that left Fay's heart both overflowing and painfully tight, because she knew exactly what her daughter was missing, and she also knew the price that had to be paid to fill that silence. She had been struggling for a very long time, carrying alone the burdens that should have been shared by two people, ever since the man who had once made promises to her quietly walked away after learning that their daughter had been born different from other children. But Fay had never allowed Josie to feel like a burden, not even once. In her eyes, Josie wasn't something that needed to be repaired, but the most precious thing in the world, something to be protected with everything she had. Before slipping into her uniform and tying her brown hair back at the nape of her neck, Faye did what she did every day before leaving for work. She picked up the picture Josie had drawn the night before, a crooked little sketch of mother and daughter holding hands beneath a large, round, misshapen sun, folded it neatly, and carefully placed it inside the pocket of her apron. She carried it with her as though she were carrying a fragment of light, so that during the long hours when standing in unfamiliar rooms made her legs numb, she could touch it and remember why she was trying so hard. Then she knelt until she was level with her daughter, took the small hands in her own, and told Josie something her own mother had told her many years ago, that people might take away your strength, and they might force you to do the hardest and most exhausting work, but only you could give them permission to take away your dignity. And as long as you held on to it, you would remain whole. Josie, of course, didn't yet understand everything those words meant, but she could feel the steadiness in her mother's voice trembling beneath her palm, and she nodded as though she understood. The building's caregiver, a kind elderly woman who lived on the floor below, would come upstairs to watch Josie until Faye returned from her shift. At the doorway, Faye looked back at her daughter one last time, and the little girl lifted the blue paper boat and waved it through the air as though sending a vessel off to sea. And in that moment, Faye felt her heart grow lighter despite all the worries pressing down upon her. Tonight's shift was at a grand party in a riverside mansion, where the wealthiest people in the city would gather, and the kind-hearted manager had trusted Faye enough to assign her there. Faye knew exactly why she needed this evening so desperately, knew exactly what might be waiting at the end of the road if she could endure just a little longer, and she descended the old, worn staircase carrying a quiet hope within her, the fragile kind of hope only a mother could truly understand, that tonight, at last, everything might begin to change. By the time night had fully fallen, and the Kane mansion blazed with light like a palace misplaced upon the earth, Faye had been standing for so long that she could no longer clearly feel her own feet. She moved among the guests in her neat serving uniform, both hands supporting a silver tray crowded with glasses of golden wine, skillfully weaving through clusters of people laughing and talking, though not one of them bothered to lean aside and give her room to pass. In that room, she was a silent shadow drifting through the light, present only long enough to refill a glass before fading away again. Nameless, faceless, remembered by no one. The women around her were wrapped in silk and diamonds that glittered beneath the crystal lights, their laughter ringing out bright and carefree, as though the whole world had been created to serve them, while Faye quietly watched it all from behind the invisible curtain that status had drawn between them and her. She didn't envy their expensive gowns or precious stones. What sent a faint ache through her heart was the weightless way they seemed to live, the way they could set down a glass of wine without giving a thought to tomorrow, while every step she took was burdened by calculations she had repeated so many times that she knew them by heart. Her feet throbbed inside the old shoes whose heels had worn thin, a dull pain climbing from her soles all the way up her spine, but she had learned to carry that exhaustion in silence, hiding it behind the courteous smile she offered each guest who held out an empty glass without looking at her even once. How many times in her life had she stood in places like this, at the edges of rooms that belonged to other people, and how many times had she reminded herself that every kind of work deserved respect when it was done with dignity? Her mother had always said so, and Faye still held on to those words like a life preserver through the longest nights. As she placed an empty glass back onto her tray and reached for another filled one, a warm hand touched her lightly at the elbow, and when she turned, she found the kind face of Mrs. Odette, the middle-aged woman who ran the catering company that had hired her for the evening. Mrs. Odette was one of the very few people in this world who truly saw her, not as a shadow but as a human being, and she gently asked whether Faye was all right, whether she needed to sit down for a few minutes behind the kitchen. Faye smiled gratefully and shook her head, because she knew she couldn't afford to miss even a moment of this night. Mrs. Odette studied her for another instant, with the knowing eyes of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the burdens hidden behind another person's calm expression, then softly told her to conserve her strength, explaining that she had assigned Faye to this event because she trusted her more than any of the temporary staff, that the wealthy families gathered here were extremely demanding, and that she needed someone who was both careful and knew how to conduct herself. That expression of trust made the bridge of Faye's nose sting, because during a time when most of the world looked straight through her, as though she were invisible, even the smallest act of kindness was enough to bring tears to her eyes. She offered a quiet word of thanks, drawing inner strength from the thought of her daughter waiting at home and the surgery that would finally change both their lives. She thought about the silence inside her little girl's ears, and about the promise a rare and gifted doctor had offered the two of them. A narrow door that was closing more tightly with every passing day, and she knew that this very night, this magnificent room she was serving in so quietly, would determine whether that door could still be opened in time. So she swallowed her weariness, lifted the tray again in hands that had gone numb, and continued forward through the laughter of strangers, telling herself that as long as she kept her head down and worked hard, as long as she made no mistakes, then by the end of the night, the reward she needed would finally rest safely in her hands. She couldn't have known that across the room. Amid the glowing splendor of the engagement celebration, a pair of cold, piercing eyes had just begun to notice her quiet presence, or that within only a few short hours, every silent plan she had been carrying inside her heart would be brought to the very edge of ruin. Several hours before the first guest set foot upon the mansion's stone steps, while servers like Faye were still hurrying to arrange everything beneath lights that hadn't yet all been lit, Rafferty Kane stood inside the secluded study in the eastern wing of the house, where the light was only bright enough to reveal the face of the man standing before him. The man was one of those under his command, someone Rafferty had once trusted with overseeing part of the money flowing through the harbor district. And now he stood there with his hands clasped together, sweat gathering at his temples even though the room remained cool. Rafferty didn't shout, didn't strike the desk, didn't do any of the things people imagined men from his world would do. He simply sat there with his back against the leather chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden desk in a slow rhythm that was chilling in its restraint. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the man had to lean forward to hear him clearly. He said that he already knew about the money that had been quietly redirected to the wrong places, knew about the figures that had been distorted in the ledgers the man had believed no one would ever trace, and he said it in the calm tone of someone reading aloud a grocery list, a calmness far more frightening than any burst of rage. The man began to stammer out explanations, offering one excuse after another, but Rafferty merely raised one hand, and the room immediately fell silent. He told him that in his world, the only thing a man truly owned was his own word, that he had pulled him out of the mud when no one else had been willing to offer a hand, had given him a roof over his head, a place to stand, and a name that others were forced to respect, and in return, he had asked for only one thing: loyalty. Now that loyalty had been sold cheaply, and Rafferty continued in the same steady voice, telling him that he would leave the organization before the night was over, return every dollar he had taken, and disappear from the city before sunrise, because Rafferty didn't want to see him again. There was no gunshot, no fist, not a single drop of blood spilled upon the gleaming floor. But when the man stumbled out through the door, his face was as pale as though he had just witnessed his own death, because everyone in the underworld understood that losing Rafferty Kane's protection was a punishment heavier than any act of violence. Silvano, the loyal right hand who had stood silently beside the door throughout the conversation, inclined his head in quiet admiration, because he had followed Rafferty long enough to understand that his employer lived by a code of his own, one he obeyed more strictly than any law in the city, a code that placed honor above violence, and a promise above blood. When the door closed and only the two men remained in the room, Rafferty rose and walked to the window, looking down at the river as it darkened beneath the gathering evening, and in that rare moment, the cold armor around him seemed to loosen slightly. Silvano quietly reminded him that the guests would soon arrive, that the Vanterpool family was already on its way, and something passed across Rafferty's face when he heard the name, a deep and private weariness he didn't bother to hide from the companion who had known him longer than anyone else. He said softly that this marriage had never been something he wanted, that it had been arranged the way people arranged a business transaction, an alliance between two powerful forces meant to strengthen territory and preserve power, and that the woman he would soon be expected to call his wife had never once made his heart stir, not even for a single beat. Silvano remained silent, because he knew there were no words that could offer comfort for such a truth. Rafferty was a man who could make an entire city hold its breath, a man who could buy anything money could touch, yet he himself was being forced into a life he hadn't chosen, and somewhere deep within the man who seemed to be made of steel, there was still an emptiness no amount of power could fill, a loneliness that had followed him from distant years he had never spoken of to anyone. He straightened his collar, restored the familiar mask of cold composure to his face, and stepped out toward the grand hall to play host to a celebration he didn't truly want, never knowing that beneath his own roof that night was someone who would soon enter his life and shake everything he believed to its foundation. There are people who carry an entire kingdom of power within them, yet hide deep inside a child who has never truly been held in anyone's arms, and Rafferty Kane was one of them. As he stood silently beside the window, watching the river darken before the guests arrived, something in that stillness drew him back to the years he had buried beneath layer after layer of time and wealth, years no one within the empire he had built was ever allowed to see. He hadn't been born among silk and luxury like the guests who would soon enter his mansion that night. He had grown up in an aging monastery on the edge of the city, a place where unwanted children were sent, a cold gray stone building with endless corridors and windows so high that a little boy had to crane his neck just to glimpse a sliver of sky. It was there that he learned very early that the world owed no one tenderness, that the promises of adults were often as fragile as mist dissolving beneath the morning sun, and that the only way a child like him could survive was to build a wall around himself that no cruel word could penetrate. He remembered the long evenings when the other children were taken away one by one, chosen by one family or another, while he remained behind, winter after winter, standing at the window and watching the cars disappear as he wondered what was wrong with him, what he lacked that made no one want to keep him. That feeling of being left behind had marked him so deeply that even later, after he had become a man capable of making an entire city bow its head, he still couldn't wash it away completely. It had only learned to hide beneath expensive clothes and eyes as cold as ice, waiting for those rare moments of weakness when it could rise again. He had understood early that if the world wouldn't give him a place within it, he would seize one with his own hands. And from that lonely child beside the monastery window grew a man who would never again allow anyone else to decide his fate. Yet among all the gray memories of those years, there remained one small fragment of light that he had never allowed to fade. Something he guarded more carefully than anything money would later buy. It was the faint memory of a gentle voice that had come to him during one of the darkest periods of his life, a clear young voice that had stayed beside him when he was at his weakest and most afraid, softly telling him things that made the darkness around him feel less terrifying. He could no longer remember the face clearly. He remembered only the strange warmth that voice had left behind, the feeling that in a world where everyone had turned away from him, there had still been someone who stayed, even if only for a little while, and chose not to abandon him. Through all the years that followed, during sleepless nights, he had sometimes wondered what had become of that person, whether she still remembered the sickly boy he had once been, or had long since forgotten him the way people forget some small and passing thing from their lives. He had never found her again, and in time, he had stopped looking, because hope was a luxury a man like him didn't allow himself to hold for very long. And yet that fragment of memory remained, quiet and enduring, like a small candle that continued to burn inside a room he kept locked and rarely entered. Silvano, who had stood beside him through countless rises and falls, would sometimes catch his employer's gaze softening in that particular way, and he understood that behind this terrifyingly powerful man was a wound that had never truly healed. Rafferty drew in a deep breath, pulled himself free from the current of memory, and settled the familiar armor of cold composure around himself once more. He couldn't have known that within only a few hours, beneath the very roof of this magnificent house, the voice he had carried with him throughout his entire life was about to return from a place he would never have dared to imagine. The celebration had reached the height of its splendor as the musicians began playing gentle melodies, and the sound of laughter rose like waves through the glittering room. And amid all that magnificence, Celeste Vanderpool sat upon a velvet-upholstered settee like a queen presiding over her own court. She wore a sumptuous wine-colored gown, her platinum blonde hair swept high to reveal the proud, graceful length of her neck, and around her gathered a circle of guests competing for her favor, catching every word she spoke as though it were a precious jewel. She was beautiful. No one could deny that, but hers was the beauty of ice upon a lake in the dead of winter, something meant to be admired, not something capable of warming anyone. More than once that evening, Celeste noticed the gaze of the man who would soon become her husband moving across the crowd. And what caught her attention wasn't where he was looking, but the way his ordinarily cold eyes seemed to pause upon the quiet figure carrying a tray between the banquet tables, lingering for a moment longer than they should have. It was only a passing glance, so faint that Rafferty himself probably hadn't realized what he had done. But Celeste was the kind of woman who had learned to measure and possess with her eyes, and something stirred softly within her chest. A vague intuition she couldn't yet name, an instinctive wariness toward the nameless woman she had never even truly noticed before. She took another sip of wine and looked away, telling herself she was imagining things, but the uneasiness didn't completely disappear. It was at that very moment, as Faye passed with the tray in her hands to collect the empty glasses, that everything happened so quickly, no one in the crowd would later be able to recount it in quite the same way. Celeste leaned forward to take a small pastry from the tray, her elbow swinging outward with a clumsiness rarely seen in her, and the hand holding her wineglass sent a stream of dark red liquid spilling across the skirt of her expensive gown. For a fraction of a second, her beautiful face froze. And then, when she realized that dozens of eyes had turned toward her, she did what spoiled people often did when humiliated. She immediately found someone else to blame. She sprang to her feet, pointed directly at Faye, and raised her voice loudly enough for an entire section of the room to hear, accusing the server of carelessly ruining a dress that, she declared, was worth an entire year of wages for someone like her. Faye stood stunned, the tray trembling slightly in her hands, and she stammered that she hadn't touched Celeste, that she had only been passing by, but how frail and insignificant her explanation sounded beside the other woman's cold and commanding voice. Celeste gave her no chance to finish. She cut her off with a stream of cruel remarks, mocking the clumsiness of lowly people and complaining that these days, even those who couldn't walk properly were being hired to serve at elegant gatherings. A few guests nearby laughed awkwardly, while others turned their faces away because they couldn't bear to watch. But not one of them spoke in Faye's defense, because in that room, she was worth less than a stain of wine upon a silk skirt. Blood rushed into Faye's cheeks and a roaring filled her ears. But she bit down hard on her lip and refused to let a single tear fall before them, because she knew that if she broke now, everything would collapse. She clenched her fists tightly, swallowing the sudden burn of humiliation as her mind fixed firmly on the one thing that mattered, the surgery her daughter so desperately needed, the narrow door that was slowly closing for her precious little girl, and the chilling fear that because of something she hadn't done, everything she had struggled for through all those long days might disappear before the night was over. Everything could have ended there, with a reprimand and a stain of wine that would dry with time, but Celeste Vanterpool wasn't the kind of woman who knew when to stop while she still held the power to humiliate someone else. She looked at the server standing before her with her head bowed, and in those cold eyes flashed something even crueler than anger, a desire to see the small, powerless woman lower herself even further, to use another person's shame to soothe her own embarrassment before the crowd. She ordered Faye to follow her into the vast entrance hall, where a few late-arriving guests were still passing through, and there, beneath the crystal lights shining down upon the cold marble floor, she forced her to kneel. She told a servant to bring a heavy silver tray crowded with burning candles and place it in Faye's hands. Then, in a voice as sweet as honey and as cold as ice, declared that she would remain there on her knees, holding the tray of candles until the final guest had left the celebration, so that she might relearn the lesson in care she had apparently forgotten. Faye looked up at her for a moment, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something, but then she closed them again, because she understood that anything she said now would only make matters worse, and she needed this night far too desperately to risk defying her. And so she knelt. The marble floor sent its cold through the thin fabric covering her knees, and at first, the chill merely made her shiver. But after a short while, it became a numbing pain that crept slowly into her calves, then deepened into a dull ache, gnawing at every joint. She raised the candle tray with both hands and held it as steadily as she could, but its weight soon made her arms begin to tremble with exhaustion, the tendons in her wrists tightening until they throbbed. Time passed with deliberate cruelty, every minute stretching into an hour, and the candle flames swayed with each breath she took. Now and then, a drop of hot wax spilled over the rim of the plate, falling onto the back of her hand and burning sharply for a moment before hardening into an opaque white streak against her skin. She didn't dare cry out, didn't dare move, but pressed her lips tightly together and swallowed the pain, keeping the tray level and refusing to let her back collapse, because she knew there were eyes glancing toward her, some curious, some pitying, some entirely indifferent, and she didn't want any of them to see her break. Tears gathered hot behind her lashes, threatening to spill, and there were moments when she thought she couldn't hold them back any longer. But then she remembered something that gave her the strength to endure. She anchored her mind on Josie's face, drawing resilience from her child's trusting smile and the silent promise she had made to give her a better life. She thought of the silence inside her daughter's ears, of the fragile door of hope that was slowly closing, and she reminded herself that if she cried, if she stood and walked away, if she allowed her pride to speak now, the price wouldn't fall upon her, but upon her innocent child. So she swallowed her tears, kept her gaze fixed upon the cold stone beneath her, and silently held fast to her mother's voice echoing from the past. They could force her to kneel, but no one could take away her dignity unless she surrendered it. Clinging to that silent strength, she refused to let the humiliation break who she was. She clung to those words as though they were a rope stretched across an abyss, refusing to let each passing minute of pain and humiliation drown the person she truly was. She didn't know how much longer she would be forced to kneel there, didn't know how much of the night still remained, and she couldn't possibly have imagined that only a few steps beyond that curtain of light, a man was about to cross the entrance hall, and that his eyes would soon come to rest upon her silent, kneeling figure in a way that would change everything. While Faye knelt silently in the entrance hall beneath the weight of the candle tray, her hands trembling from the strain, Silvano quietly approached Rafferty on the other side of the mansion as he was speaking with a group of important guests, then leaned close and whispered a few words into his ear. It concerned the man who had been cast out earlier that afternoon, the one who had just tried to contact someone at the harbor in an attempt to change the situation before disappearing from the city, and Silvano explained that there was a call his employer needed to handle personally and immediately, somewhere private and away from the watchful eyes of the guests. Rafferty gave a faint nod, excused himself from the group with a cool, courteous smile, then left the main hall and crossed the quiet corridors toward the secluded study where he could take the call without interruption. The shortest route led him through the vast marble entrance hall, a place he would normally have crossed without so much as a glance, because his mind was occupied with thoughts of the traitor and whatever dangers might still remain. But the moment he stepped into that wide-open space, his stride came to a halt. In the center of the entrance hall, beneath the cold light pouring down from the crystal fixtures, a woman was kneeling on the stone floor, both hands holding up a tray of burning candles. Her back remained strangely straight despite the posture of submission, and though her head was bowed, it hadn't fallen. Something in that image seized hold of him and refused to let go. He had seen countless people kneel throughout his life, men who knelt from fear, who knelt to beg, who knelt to flatter, and he had always been able to read those gestures instantly, always seen the cowardice or calculation within them. But this woman was different. She knelt without pleading with anyone, without glancing around in search of pity, without revealing even the smallest sign of surrender in her spirit. There was a peculiar dignity in the stillness of her posture, the dignity of someone who had been pushed as low as a person could be pushed, yet still refused to let anyone touch the essential part of who she was. And that alone made a man who rarely stopped for anyone stand motionless at the threshold of the entrance hall, forgetting entirely about the call waiting for him. He didn't recognize her face and didn't yet know her name, but something faint stirred inside his chest, a strange sense of familiarity he couldn't put into words, as though some distant memory had shifted beneath the weight of all the intervening years. He turned slightly toward Silvano, who had quietly stopped beside him, and asked in a low voice, who had ordered the woman to kneel in the middle of his home like that. Silvano hesitated for a moment, because he knew the answer wouldn't please his employer, then quietly replied that it had been Miss Vanterpool's command, that people said the server had accidentally spilled a little wine on her gown, and that this was the punishment she had imposed in front of the guests. For a moment, Rafferty's face didn't change. Not a single muscle moved. Silvano immediately noted the sudden shift in his employer's demeanor, a quiet, dangerous tension that signaled a storm brewing beneath the surface. Rafferty remembered the unconscious glance he had cast toward a quiet figure at the beginning of the celebration, and now, looking more closely, he realized that she was the same woman kneeling before him. He remained there for another heartbeat, watching her in silence, and something shifted within the most powerful man in Louisiana as a decision quietly began to take shape. Then he told Silvano in a low voice that the call could wait, and he slowly walked toward the woman kneeling in the center of the entrance hall, each footstep sounding softly against the stone floor, carrying with it something no one in the mansion that night could possibly have foreseen. Rafferty's footsteps sounded softly against the marble floor, and when he stopped in front of Faye, she still didn't dare raise her head. All she could see within the downward cast of her gaze was the pair of polished leather shoes belonging to a man standing before her, and she immediately assumed that yet another guest had come to look at her as though she were some form of entertainment. But what happened next made her entire body stiffen in astonishment. The man didn't remain standing above her, looking down as everyone else had done. He slowly bent one knee and lowered himself until he was level with her in the middle of that magnificent entrance hall, heedless of his expensive suit and the eyes of those who still lingered nearby, and with hands that were steady yet unexpectedly gentle, he carefully lifted the heavy candle tray from her trembling grasp and set it aside. Faye looked up at him in bewilderment, and for the first time that evening, she gazed directly into the face of the mansion's owner, into those cold gray eyes that now held something she hadn't expected to find there. Not pity, but a quiet respect. He asked whether she could stand, his voice low and soft. And when she swayed because her legs had been numb for so long, he reached out to support her by the elbow and guided her toward the settee against the wall, helping her sit as though she were an honored guest rather than a servant who had just been forced to kneel in the middle of his home. She sat there with both hands still trembling, opaque white trails of hardened candle wax marking the backs of her hands. She stammered that she was fine, that she didn't want to cause anyone any more trouble. He didn't answer immediately. He simply watched her for a long moment, then quietly asked her name. She hesitated before speaking it in a voice barely above a whisper. Faye Delacroix. He repeated the name once, as though weighing it upon his tongue, then asked where she came from and how long she had lived in the city. She answered him in short, cautious sentences, explaining that she had been there for nearly her entire life, that her mother had brought her to the city when she was still very young. He asked what her mother had done for a living, and something softened faintly in Faye's voice when she spoke of her. She said that her mother had taken every kind of laboring job she could find to raise her, that she had cleaned houses, cared for the sick, and worked herself relentlessly until her heart could no longer endure the strain, and that she had passed out of Faye's life many years ago. Rafferty listened to every word with an attentiveness no one had ever given to the small stories of her life. And then he asked, gently, why a woman like her would accept such a punishing night of work, why she had endured it through clenched teeth instead of simply walking away. Faye fell silent for a moment, and perhaps it was the unexpected tenderness in his voice that softened the defenses she had spent so long building, because she quietly told him that she had a little daughter, that the child couldn't fully hear the world around her, that a rare and gifted doctor had promised to help her, but that the door was slowly closing because Faye hadn't yet gathered everything they needed, and that tonight, this very night, had been meant to be her final chance to hold it open. She spoke without complaint and without embellishing her pain in the hope of winning anyone's sympathy. She simply told him the truth, in the calm voice of someone who had grown accustomed to carrying every burden alone, and that calmness made her story feel heavier than any sobbing ever could. Rafferty sat beside her in silence, and something tightened inside the man who had once made an entire city bow its head. Then he asked her one question, a question so simple that no one had ever thought to ask it before. He quietly asked when the last time was that anyone had asked whether she was all right. Faye opened her mouth to answer, but then she realized that she couldn't. She searched through her memories, turning over the long years in her mind, the days when she had carried everything alone, the nights when she had soothed her daughter to sleep before crying quietly in the darkness, the mornings when she had stepped out into the world wearing a smile she had forced upon her face, and she understood that it had been so long, so terribly long, that she could no longer remember, since anyone had stopped to ask her that question. The entire world needed her to be strong, needed her to endure, needed her to keep moving forward, but no one had ever asked whether she herself was beginning to fall apart. And in that moment, when she recognized that simple and painful truth, something inside her finally broke. The tears she had held back throughout the entire night, throughout all those long years, at last spilled over and traveled silently down her cheeks, not because she had been humiliated, not because her legs ached or her hands burned, but because for the first time in so many years, someone had asked her a kind question, and that unexpected kindness had reached a place in her heart she herself had forgotten was still capable of hurting. Rafferty sat silently beside her as the tears streamed down her face, and he didn't rush to fill the silence with empty words of comfort. He simply remained there, patient and still, until she wiped away the last tear and softly apologized for allowing herself to appear weak in front of him. Then, as though trying to pull herself free from the emotion, she quietly added that her mother had always taught her to be strong, that she had been the most resilient woman Faye had ever known. He gently asked what her mother's name had been, and she replied that her name was Marguerite. The instant that name left her lips, Rafferty felt a chill travel down his spine, because it wasn't an unfamiliar name to him. It was a name that had lain dormant in the deepest chamber of his memory for all these years. He struggled to keep his voice calm as he asked whether her mother, the woman named Marguerite, had ever worked at an old monastery on the outskirts of the city, a place called St. Vincent. Faye looked up at him, briefly surprised by the strange question, then slowly nodded and said that she had. When Faye was very young, her mother had cleaned and helped with chores there, and whenever there was no one available to watch her, Marguerite had been forced to bring her along. As fragments of those distant memories began to return, Faye's voice grew far away, as though it were echoing from another lifetime. She told him that there had been a boy there, a pale and gaunt teenager whom she often saw curled up alone, a boy who seemed to have no family, and who was always so quiet and sorrowful that even her young heart had ached for him. She spoke of one particular night, the night when the boy had developed such a high fever that his entire body trembled uncontrollably. When all the adults had gone to sleep, and the monastery corridors had fallen into cold darkness, and only the little girl she had been had crept quietly toward his bed, the boy had been afraid of the darkness, afraid of being left alone in his pain. And she, though only a 9-year-old girl, hadn't known what else to do except sit beside him, pull the thin blanket back over his body, and softly tell him stories she invented so he could forget his fear. She said that to comfort him that night, she had taken a sheet of paper and folded it into a small boat, then whispered that the boat would carry him across the darkest night and toward the sun, that as long as he held on to it, he would never have to be alone in the darkness again. She told Rafferty that she had remained beside the boy until he fell asleep, and during the nights that followed, she had continued to slip away and sit with him whenever she accompanied her mother, until one day Marguerite was no longer asked to work there, and Faye never learned what became of the boy she had known. Throughout her story, Rafferty sat motionless, as though he had turned to stone, his face growing paler with every passing moment, while the hands that had always been steady began to tremble faintly upon his knees. Because he was that boy, the night she had just described, the little paper boat, the gentle voice that had remained beside him during the most terrifying darkness of his childhood. All of it came rushing back with such vivid force that he could scarcely breathe, and he realized that the woman sitting before him, the woman his own fiancée had just forced to kneel in the middle of his home, was the small fragment of light he had carried in his heart throughout his entire life. Slowly, as though afraid that one sudden movement might cause the moment to disappear, he reached inside his coat and withdrew something he had always kept close to him, a small paper boat yellowed by the passing years, its folds worn and so fragile that it seemed a single breath might tear it apart. He had preserved it all these years, inside a sealed box in a dry place, carrying it through every rise and fall of his life, as though it were a sacred talisman, and he had never once unfolded it, had never dared to loosen its creases, because to him, it was the only holy thing remaining from a time when he had possessed nothing else to hold on to. He placed the little boat in his trembling palm, and held it out before Faye, and when she saw it, her breath caught in her throat and her eyes widened, because even after so many years, she immediately recognized the clumsy folds made by her own 9-year-old hands. Two people from worlds separated by an immeasurable distance sat together in a silent moment within the marble entrance hall, and understood that fate had brought them back to one another after all those years, and that the fragile thread connecting them had never truly been broken. Standing silently a few steps away, Silvano watched everything unfolding between his employer and the serving woman, and a depth of emotion rose within the older man that even he hadn't expected. He had followed Rafferty for nearly an entire lifetime, had watched him rise from a man with nothing to someone the whole city feared and respected, and Silvano had always believed that he understood him better than anyone else still alive. He knew that the ice-cold face the world found so terrifying was only a suit of armor Rafferty wore to protect himself from a world that had treated him with unbearable cruelty since childhood. People saw only Rafferty Kane, the powerful crime boss, a man who could make others tremble with a single glance. But Silvano had witnessed things no one else was ever permitted to see. He remembered the times Rafferty had quietly done things he would never tell anyone about and would never allow anyone else to mention. He remembered a poor family living near the harbor who had once been on the verge of losing their only home, and how one morning their debt had suddenly been paid in full by someone who offered no explanation and asked for nothing in return, and only Silvano knew whose hand had been behind it. He remembered a shoeshine boy on the street corner Rafferty passed every morning, a thin child with defiant eyes in whom Rafferty seemed to recognize the boy he himself had once been. And Silvano knew that it was Rafferty who had quietly arranged for that child to receive a proper education and a future far removed from the cold pavement, without ever once admitting what he had done. He remembered the late nights when Rafferty believed no one was watching, when he stood by the window and gazed over the city with a loneliness so heavy that no amount of wealth or power could soothe it, the loneliness of a man who possessed everything, yet had never truly belonged to anyone. Silvano understood that behind the strict code of honor Rafferty followed, behind the way he never harmed the weak and always stepped forward to protect those without a voice, there was a heart that had been wounded too early and too deeply, a heart that still remembered with painful clarity what it felt like to be abandoned by the entire world. And because he remembered, he could never bear to let anyone else suffer the same fate when he had the power to prevent it. The world called him dangerous, and it wasn't wrong, but it didn't know that his danger had never been directed at the innocent. It was reserved for the powerful who preyed upon the weak, for those who betrayed trust, and for those who trampled another person's dignity simply because they possessed the power to do so. And now, as Silvano watched his employer kneel until he was level with a serving woman, as he saw the hands that had always been steady as steel tremble faintly while holding the little paper boat, he suddenly understood that this woman wasn't a chance stranger, but some missing piece from the very past Rafferty had never revealed to anyone, not even to him. Silvano didn't yet know the whole story, but he had lived beside Rafferty long enough to read what was happening inside him through the smallest signs, and he recognized that for the first time in many years, the ice surrounding Rafferty's heart was beginning to melt, revealing the true man he had hidden for far too long. A quiet hope rose within Silvano, because he had witnessed too many of Rafferty's lonely nights, and had secretly wished too many times that the man he respected and loved like a son might finally find something that truly belonged to him, something that would give him a reason to live beyond power and calculation. He thought of the cold arranged marriage Rafferty had never wanted, of the proud woman who had just forced this girl to kneel in the middle of his home, and he saw more clearly than ever the irony of fate, that the genuine affection Rafferty had longed for his entire life had come from the place no one would ever have expected, from a woman who possessed nothing but a compassionate heart and a dignity that couldn't be bought. Silvano quietly stepped back so he wouldn't disturb the sacred moment unfolding between those two people, and deep inside, he knew that this night would be the night when his employer's life, and perhaps the life of that suffering woman as well, would forever turn in a different direction. Rafferty rose from the marble floor, and when he reached out to help Faye, there was a new decisiveness in every movement he made, the decisiveness of a man who had just recovered something he believed he had lost forever and was now determined never to let it be trampled again. She hesitated and softly said that she didn't want to cause any more trouble, that she only wished to finish her work quietly, but he looked at her with an expression that was both gentle and resolute, and told her in a low voice that the time had come for something to be said before everyone. He guided her beside him through the corridor and back into the magnificent ballroom, where the music was still flowing softly and the wine still shimmered gold inside crystal glasses, and the moment he appeared in the doorway with the serving woman at his side, the conversations throughout the room gradually faded, one group after another, until the vast hall sank into curious silence. Rafferty walked to the center of the room, and in the deep, slightly rough voice that needed only to rise a little to make an entire gathering hold its breath, he said that he had something to say to every guest who had come beneath his roof that evening. Every gaze turned toward him, and toward the woman standing quietly beside him in her plain serving uniform, her eyes still reddened from tears. He searched for Celeste among the crowd, and when he found her seated upon the velvet settee with an expression that held both surprise and displeasure, he asked her in a voice loud enough for the entire room to hear whether it was true that she had ordered this woman to kneel in the entrance hall of his home throughout the evening. For a moment, Celeste was caught off guard, but she quickly recovered her proud composure, gave a faint shrug, and replied that it had been a trivial matter, hardly worth his attention in the middle of the celebration, that the woman had ruined her expensive gown and needed to be taught a lesson in care. Rafferty looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes growing colder with every passing second, then said in a voice that remained even yet cut like a blade that this woman hadn't spilled anything at all, that Celeste herself had knocked over her own glass, and then blamed an innocent person simply because she had no power with which to defend herself. Murmurs began to ripple through the room, and Celeste's face changed briefly, but she still tried to preserve her arrogance, letting out a soft laugh and saying that he was turning a small incident into a spectacle over a common servant, that surely he wasn't intending to humiliate his own fiancée in front of all their guests for the sake of a serving woman whose name no one had even cared to remember. It was that sentence, spoken in such cold contempt, that exposed before everyone the true nature hidden beneath her polished beauty, and Rafferty looked at her as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. Then he turned toward the crowd, now silent with tension, placed one hand upon Faye's shoulder, and in a quiet voice filled with something that sent a shiver through the entire room, said that the woman standing beside him, the woman everyone there had treated as though she were invisible, was the reason he was still standing before them that night. He said that many years ago, when he had been a child with nothing and no one, during the darkest period of his life, she, who had only been a little girl herself, had given him what the whole vast world had denied him: kindness and a reason not to give up. He didn't speak at length, and he didn't expose his old wounds before strangers. He said only that much, but the weight carried in every word silenced the room, and many of the guests began looking at the serving woman with entirely different eyes. He continued by saying that he had built his entire life upon one belief, that a person's true worth wasn't found in status or wealth, but in the way they treated those who could offer them nothing in return, and that tonight, beneath his own roof, he had watched two people reveal their true selves completely, one who had preserved her dignity even while being humiliated, and another who, when given power, had chosen to use it to crush someone weaker. Celeste sprang to her feet, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, but her protests suddenly sounded feeble and shameless within the heavy silence of the room, where for the first time in her life, she tasted what it meant to have an entire crowd turn away from her. Rafferty turned to Celeste, his voice dropping to a sharp, controlled register that instantly cut through the silence of the ballroom, and in the terrifyingly calm voice that those who understood him knew was more dangerous than any shout. He said that their marriage would end here and now, that very night, before everyone who had come to witness their engagement. The entire room seemed to stop breathing, glasses suspended midway to waiting lips, and Celeste stood frozen for a moment before fury surged through her. She hissed that he couldn't do this, that he couldn't destroy everything because of some common servant, that he had no idea what price he would pay for such madness. At that very moment, an imposing older man slowly emerged from the crowd. It was Auguste Vanterpool, Celeste's father, one of the most formidable powers in the city's hidden financial world, a man even Rafferty couldn't afford to dismiss lightly. He regarded Rafferty with the cold gaze of someone accustomed to giving orders and seeing them obeyed, then spoke in a deep, gravelly voice, heavy with threat, warning that Rafferty should think very carefully about what he was about to do, and that the alliance between their two families had been cultivated too meticulously to be discarded in a moment of reckless impulse, and that if Rafferty dared humiliate his daughter before everyone in this manner, he would make him regret it. He would withdraw every form of support, turn Rafferty's allies into enemies, and shake the empire he had built down to its very foundations. He delivered those words with the confidence of a man certain of victory, convinced that the strength of his family was enough to make anyone retreat. But Rafferty didn't waver. He looked directly into the older man's eyes, and the faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth, a smile without the slightest trace of warmth, one that sent a chill down the spine of anyone who saw it. In an even voice, he said that Mr. Vanterpool appeared to have forgotten who Rafferty was and how much he knew. Then, he lowered his voice further, speaking just loudly enough for the older man to hear every word, and mentioned certain matters, names, figures, and shadowy transactions Auguste had believed were safely buried beneath layer after layer of polished respectability, secrets that, if dragged into the light, wouldn't destroy Rafferty's empire, but would bring the entire Vanterpool dynasty crashing down. Rafferty never raised his voice, and never threatened him openly. He simply laid out what he possessed with the composure of a man placing pieces upon a chessboard, and with every word he spoke, Auguste Vanterpool's arrogant face grew paler, the confidence in his eyes fading until it vanished completely, replaced by the alarm of a man who had just realized he had disastrously underestimated his opponent. No one else in the ballroom heard everything Rafferty said, but they all saw clearly what was happening. They saw one of the most powerful men in the city lower his head into silence before a truth he didn't dare allow to be exposed. And in that moment, everyone understood that Rafferty Kane wasn't a man anyone could intimidate. Auguste Vanterpool remained there for another moment, his lips moving as though he wished to say something. But no words came, and at last he gave a single bitter nod and signaled for his daughter to prepare to leave, because he understood that he had lost that night and that his defeat was absolute. Celeste stared at her father in stunned disbelief, then turned toward Rafferty with eyes filled with hatred. But she had nothing left to say, because every weapon she and her family had once possessed had become useless. When the Vanterpools finally disappeared beyond the great doors amid the murmuring of the crowd, Rafferty turned back toward Faye, who still stood silently at the edge of the ballroom, trembling from everything she had just witnessed, her narrow shoulders quivering beneath the thin fabric of her uniform. Before the eyes of all those wealthy and powerful guests, The man feared by the entire city slowly removed the coat from his own body, still warm from the heat of him, and gently placed it around her trembling shoulders, as though he were shielding something precious he had lost for far too long, and was now determined never to let grow cold again. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke more clearly than 1,000 words. And there, in the magnificent room where she had been treated as though she were nothing more than an invisible shadow, Faye Delacroix was finally seen as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. When the last guests had gradually departed, and the mansion began to sink into the stillness of late night, Rafferty led Faye into a small reading room tucked away in a quiet corner of the house, where warm lamplight fell across bookshelves reaching all the way to the ceiling and a fire crackled in the hearth, driving away the cold. He invited her to sit in a soft armchair, then prepared a cup of hot tea for her with his own hands, gently brushing aside her embarrassed attempt to refuse. And there was no trace in that simple gesture of a master condescending to a servant, only the care of one human being for another. She sat there with both hands wrapped around the warm cup, his coat still resting across her shoulders, quietly studying the man who had overturned an entire celebration because of her, her heart crowded with emotions she couldn't begin to name. Rafferty sat down across from her and said that he wanted to help, that he could arrange her daughter's surgery, remove every burden pressing down upon her shoulders, and give her and the little girl a life she had never dared to dream of. But instead of crying out with joy as he expected, Faye slowly shook her head, and with a calmness that took him by surprise, she said that she was deeply grateful for his kindness, but she hadn't come there to accept charity from anyone. She told him that she had spent her entire life standing on her own 2 feet, that what she needed wasn't money handed down out of pity, but to be seen as a human being with dignity, and that if he helped her only because he felt sorry for her, then he would be taking away the one thing she had managed to preserve through all those years of hardship. Her words left Rafferty silent, because in a world filled with people who were always trying to take something from him, this was the first time anyone had refused what he offered simply to protect her own self-respect, and that only made him value her more deeply. He quietly told her that he understood, and that he didn't see her as someone deserving of pity, but as a person to whom he had owed a debt for his entire life. In the warm glow of the fire, when she reached forward to set her cup on the table, her sleeve slipped back slightly, and Rafferty caught sight of a faint scar on her wrist. He didn't ask about it, but his gaze rested there for a moment, and Faye, as though sensing it, gently pulled her sleeve down before quietly telling him the story. She said that there had been a period when she had pushed herself to the edge of exhaustion to provide for her daughter, taking several jobs at once, working nearly all day and through the night, yet still never earning enough, and that one day her body had finally given out. She had collapsed from exhaustion, and the scar was what remained from that day. She didn't tell him this to seek sympathy, but only as though recounting a fact from the past, and yet it was the very calmness in her voice that made Rafferty's heart ache. Then she lightly touched the finger where a ring should have been, and told him that the last precious thing she had ever possessed was her mother's wedding ring, the only keepsake left from the woman who had taught her about dignity, and that she had been forced to sell it to gather a little more money for her daughter. She said she could still remember the emptiness on her hand the day she had to let it go. Rafferty listened to every word, and he understood that the woman sitting before him had sacrificed everything she owned, piece by piece, quietly and without a single complaint, simply to preserve one small thread of hope for her child. After Faye had withdrawn to the guest room he had arranged for her, Silvano entered, and Rafferty asked him about something that had troubled him throughout the evening. Why, in a mansion filled with servants, Celeste had chosen this particular woman to humiliate. Silvano considered the question for a moment, then slowly replied that he had noticed something unusual, that from the beginning of the celebration, Miss Vanterpool had seemed to watch Faye with a peculiar expression, and he suspected that she had seen the moment Rafferty's gaze had unconsciously lingered on the young woman. With the sharp instincts and jealousy of someone accustomed to possessing whatever she desired, Celeste must have felt threatened by that faint attention, even though she had no idea who Faye was or what she meant to him, and so she had deliberately driven her into the deepest possible humiliation, trying to push her beyond Rafferty's sight before that invisible threat could grow into anything more. Hearing this, Rafferty fell still, because he realized that Celeste's cruelty that night hadn't been a momentary impulse, but a cold and deliberate calculation. And yet, with bitter irony, it was that very calculation that had brought him back to the woman fate had once placed in his path. The weeks following that fateful night passed like a dream. Faye still didn't quite dare to believe was real, because for the first time in so many years, the burden upon her shoulders seemed to have grown a little lighter. Rafferty remained true to his promise to respect her. He didn't throw money at her simply to ease his own conscience, but quietly searched for ways to help that would allow her to preserve her self-respect, and between them there slowly began to form a fragile bond neither of them had yet dared to name. She returned to her usual work, continued caring for her daughter with all the love in her heart, and somewhere deep inside her, a small faith began to take root, the belief that perhaps the door of hope for her child might finally open. But at the very moment she allowed herself to hope, fate struck her with a cruel blow she could never have foreseen. Late one afternoon, just after she had brought her daughter home from the elderly caregiver's apartment, her old telephone rang, and on the other end came the hesitant, guilt-ridden voice of the person responsible for the Financial Assistance Fund, the private fund that had promised to cover most of the cost of her daughter's surgery. The person told her awkwardly that there had been an unexpected change, that the assistance originally reserved for her daughter's case had now been redirected to another case considered a higher priority, that the decision had come from people above them and was beyond their power to challenge, and that they were deeply sorry but couldn't do anything else. Faye stood frozen. The telephone pressed against her ear suddenly, feeling impossibly heavy, and it seemed as though the ground beneath her feet had collapsed. She struggled to keep her voice calm as she asked whether there was any way to reverse the decision, whether some mistake had been made. But every answer she received was filled with helplessness and meaningless apologies. When the call ended, she remained motionless in the middle of the small room, her hand still gripping the telephone, while a cold despair rose and swallowed her whole. The door she had sacrificed so much sweat and so many tears to keep open, the fragile hope she had believed was finally within reach, had slipped from her hands once again, and this time she couldn't understand why. She looked toward her daughter, who was sitting quietly and playing in the corner, her innocent little face completely unaware of what had just happened, and Faye quickly turned away so the child wouldn't see the tears gathering in her eyes, forcing herself to swallow the grief in her throat so their small room could remain a place of peace for her. She didn't allow her daughter to touch even the smallest fragment of that fear. She still smiled at her, still gathered her into her arms, still let those tiny fingers rest against her cheek and feel the gentle vibrations of her mother's voice, because she had promised herself that no matter how cruel the world became, her daughter would always grow up surrounded by love rather than fear. Only after night had fallen and the child was sound asleep did Faye sit alone in the darkness and try to understand what had truly happened. She remembered the words of the fund representative, the way they had said the decision came from somewhere higher, and a vague instinct made her heart feel unbearably heavy. Then she recalled a strange detail she had dismissed several days earlier. A call from an unfamiliar number she hadn't answered, followed by a brief message from a name she had tried for years to forget. The name of the man who had abandoned her and their daughter after learning that the child had been born different. The message had done little more than ask how she and the little girl were doing, written in an unusually sweet tone, offering a false concern he had never shown in all the years before, and at the time, she had felt only irritation and ignored it. But now, when she placed it beside what had just happened, a quiet uneasiness began to creep into her heart. She couldn't yet understand the whole truth or fit those scattered pieces into a complete picture, but a mother's instinct told her that what had happened wasn't a coincidence, that somewhere in the darkness, an unseen hand was deliberately trying to tear away her child's last precious chance, and the thought tightened around her heart with a fear and fury unlike anything she had ever known. When Faye went to Rafferty and told him about the telephone call that had taken away her daughter's chance, she tried to keep her voice calm, but her eyes couldn't conceal her fear and confusion, and he listened to every word as his expression grew darker with each passing moment. He didn't say much. He only reassured her that she should leave the matter to him, that she wouldn't have to face this alone ever again. But the moment she left, his composure hardened into a resolute determination to expose whoever was behind the scheme. He summoned Silvano and ordered him to uncover the truth from beginning to end, because the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by schemes told him that this was no coincidence. With a network of connections spread throughout the city and access to sources few others possessed, it didn't take long for the pieces to begin falling into place, and what Silvano uncovered made even him frown. The decision to withdraw the financial assistance for Faye's daughter hadn't resulted from some accidental change within the fund at all. It had come from hidden pressure applied by the Vanterpool family itself. After the night she had been humiliated before all their guests, Celeste hadn't quietly swallowed her resentment as people assumed. She had secretly nurtured her hatred, and with the power of her father behind her, she had resolved to take revenge upon the woman she blamed for losing everything. Most frightening of all was the way she had done it. Celeste had paid investigators to dig into Faye's life, searching through every corner of her past, until they found the most vulnerable place of all. And in the end, they reached the very person who had once caused her the deepest pain, the man who had abandoned her and their daughter years before. He was now drowning in debt, and when agents of the Vanterpool family approached him with enough money to erase everything he owed, he hadn't hesitated for a moment before betraying Faye and selling the most private information about her and their child. He told them exactly which assistance fund she depended upon and revealed the child's last fragile chance, allowing Celeste to use her father's influence over the fund's major donors and force the promised support to be redirected elsewhere. It was a cold and vicious blow aimed directly at the softest place in a mother's heart. And when Silvano finished recounting everything, Rafferty remained silent for a long time, his hands tightening against the surface of his desk, while the anger inside him didn't burst into flame but hardened into iron resolve. Yet he wasn't a man who answered cruelty with blind violence, because he understood that the sweetest revenge wasn't to destroy an enemy, but to make every one of their schemes completely meaningless. Instead of rushing into a bloody war with the Vanterpools, he chose to use his own power and wealth to restore everything they had taken away, and far more besides. He personally assumed the full cost of Faye's daughter's surgery, not through any fund that others might manipulate, but through resources that belonged entirely to him, beyond the reach of every Vanterpool hand. He didn't stop there. Through his far-reaching connections, he sought out a specialist regarded as one of the finest in the field, a physician even more accomplished than the doctor who had previously offered Faye hope, and arranged for the child to be examined and treated by the best hands that money and power could provide. He accomplished all of it quietly and quickly, without spectacle and without asking for gratitude, simply building a shield around Faye and her daughter that no dark power would ever be able to penetrate again. And once every arrangement had been secured, he had a private message delivered to the Vanterpool family. Not a loud threat, but a warning both cold and unmistakably clear that the woman and the child were now under his protection, and that anyone who dared touch them again would face consequences they understood better than anyone. From that moment forward, the shadow that had been stalking the lives of mother and daughter was forced to retreat into silence, because those behind it knew they had struck against a wall that none of their power could ever move. The final days before her daughter's surgery passed in a strange state Faye had never experienced before, a mingling of steadily growing hope and a restless uneasiness she couldn't seem to shake. At night, after her child had fallen deeply asleep, she would often sit quietly beside the window and look out at the city glittering with lights, and in that stillness, her mind would slowly turn back through the long road she had traveled to reach this moment. She thought of everything she had surrendered along the way, the dreams she had quietly folded away and set aside so her shoulders would remain free to carry what mattered more, the endless nights she had gone without sleep, the meals she had given up, the small pleasures she had denied herself, all for one purpose alone, to preserve a future for her daughter. She had never allowed herself to stop and feel sorry for her own suffering, because she feared that if she gave in to weakness for even a moment, she might no longer have the strength to rise and keep moving forward. But now, with the burden beginning to lift and light finally appearing at the end of the road, the emotions she had held back for so long quietly returned. She realized that her greatest fear had never been hardship or poverty, but the fear that one day she would no longer be able to protect her child, that this vast and merciless world would hurt her little girl before Faye could shield her from it. And now, for the first time in all those years, she felt that fear begin to soften, not because she had become stronger, but because she no longer had to carry everything alone. Throughout those days, Rafferty remained beside her in a way that was entirely his own, quiet and without display. He didn't overwhelm her, didn't speak in beautiful promises, and didn't try to fill the space between them with grand gestures. He was simply there, a steady presence she could lean upon whenever her heart felt most uncertain. Some afternoons, he came only to sit with her in silence, drink a cup of tea, ask a few gentle questions about her daughter, and then quietly leave again, and it was that very simplicity that warmed her heart in a way no expensive gift ever could. She slowly began to understand that beneath the cold exterior that made the entire city fear him was a man of profound loneliness, someone who, like her, had once been rejected by the world, and perhaps that was why two people who seemed separated by an immeasurable distance could share such a silent understanding without needing to put it into words. She saw the tenderness in the way he was always careful never to make her feel indebted to him, the respect in the way he allowed her to make every decision concerning her own life and her daughter's, and also the quiet longing in his eyes whenever he looked at her, the longing of a man who had spent his whole life searching for somewhere he truly belonged. Rafferty, for his part, couldn't name the feeling growing inside him either. He only knew that those quiet afternoons with her had become the part of each day he looked forward to most, that the world of power and calculation, which had once meant everything to him, now seemed to fade whenever he thought of her gentle smile. He, a man who had never allowed himself to be vulnerable before anyone, found himself becoming strangely tender whenever he was near this woman and her little girl, as though a part of himself he had lost in childhood was slowly coming back to life. Neither of them hurried, and neither spoke aloud of what was quietly beginning to grow between them, because they both understood that the most precious things in life were never nurtured in haste. Their feelings continued to deepen slowly and steadily, like a small shoot rising from soil that had once been barren. And during those anxious nights of waiting, for the first time in their lives, both Faye and Rafferty felt something they had been missing for far too long, the peace of knowing they no longer had to walk through this world alone. Until one afternoon, when the soft golden light of late day spread like honey across the small living room, Rafferty met Faye's daughter for the first time. He, the man who had once made even the hardest men tremble with a single glance, found himself strangely uncertain when he stepped into the room and saw the little girl's wide, round eyes looking up at him. He didn't know how to behave before such a small and delicate life, because his entire existence had never made room for the tenderness of childhood, and he paused at the threshold, afraid that his cold appearance and the scar upon his face might frighten her and make her retreat. But Josie wasn't afraid at all. She tilted her head and studied the unfamiliar visitor with the innocent curiosity of a child, her clear eyes holding no trace of caution. And then, as though drawn by something only a child's heart could sense, she slowly walked toward him. Rafferty stood as still as stone, not daring to move, nearly holding his breath for fear of startling her. Josie looked up at his tall figure, then did what she always did with people she wanted to hear. She rose onto her toes and gently placed her tiny hand against the scarred side of his face. In that moment, something inside the chest of the man who had endured so many storms in life quietly broke open, because he understood that she was trying to listen to him in her own way, feeling his presence through the tips of those little fingers. He slowly knelt so his face would be level with hers, allowing her small hand to remain against his cheek, and in the deep, rough voice that had known only how to give commands, now so soft and gentle that even he found it unfamiliar, he began to whisper to her. In that quiet voice, he began to retell the very tale that had once saved him, the story of a small paper vessel brave enough to sail through the darkest night toward the dawn, brought back to life by the tiny hands touching his face. Josie felt his voice vibrating beneath her palm, steady and warm, and she smiled, a pure, radiant smile that seemed to melt his heart. Faye stood silently in the doorway watching them, and her eyes blurred with tears as she saw the most powerful man she had ever known, kneeling with such tenderness before her little daughter. Then Rafferty reached inside his coat, and with the reverence of someone touching the most sacred thing in the world, he drew out the paper boat, yellowed with age, that he had preserved throughout his entire life. He gazed at it for a long moment in his palm, the little boat he had never once dared unfold through all those years because he feared damaging its fragile creases, because he feared losing the only thing that remained from that dark period of his life. But now, in this warm room, beside the woman who had folded it and her little daughter, he felt that the time had come. With trembling hands, he slowly loosened each fold worn thin by the passing years, opening the paper boat with extraordinary care, and when the old sheet lay flat upon his palm, his heart seemed to miss a beat. Inside the boat, in a place he had never seen throughout all those years, there was a crooked line written in the immature pencil strokes of a child, faded but still legible. They were the words 9-year-old Faye had quietly written before folding the paper closed and giving the boat to the sick boy, an innocent message she had never spoken aloud, containing only a few simple words: "Don't be afraid of the dark." Rafferty stared at the sentence, and an overwhelming emotion rose in his throat, leaving him unable to speak, because those were the very words he had longed to hear throughout his lonely childhood, the words no one had ever said to him, and yet they had been there all along, hidden inside the paper boat he had carried with him for so many years, silently protecting him without his ever knowing. Faye stepped closer, saw the words, and covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks, because she too had completely forgotten that she had once written them, the message one compassionate child had wanted to leave for a suffering, lonely boy. Most miraculous of all was the way those words matched almost perfectly what she still whispered to Josie every night before her daughter fell asleep, the sentence she always spoke against the little girl's hand so she could feel it, that she must never be afraid of the dark because someone would always be beside her. In that moment, among three people shaped by three different destinies, a circle of love and kindness closed at last, linking the past to the present, joining the lonely child of long ago to the little girl of today, and drawing two wounded hearts closer together than they had ever been before. Several months later, on a spring morning when the city seemed to awaken beneath the clear sunlight, the miracle Faye had prayed for through so many years finally became a reality. Josie's surgery had been a complete success, even better than mother and daughter had dared to dream, and after weeks of anxious waiting and hopeful recovery, the day arrived when the little girl's ears would finally be awakened to the world in full. That morning, in the small room filled with sunlight, Faye sat down in front of her daughter as she did every day, and out of a habit that had become woven into every part of her short life, Josie lifted her little hand to place it against her mother's cheek so she could feel the familiar voice. But Faye gently held that hand, smiling through the tears rising in her eyes, and then she called her daughter's name, very softly, very tenderly, speaking it with all the love she had carried within her heart through all those years. And then the miracle happened. Josie suddenly became still, her round eyes widening in astonishment, and slowly she drew her hand away from her mother's cheek and raised it to touch her own ears, as though she couldn't believe what had just happened. For the first time in her life, she could hear her mother's voice ringing out clearly and completely, no longer needing to feel it through the vibrations beneath her palm, but hearing it with her own ears, the gentlest sound she had ever known. In that moment, Josie's innocent face lit up with such pure joy that anyone who witnessed it would have struggled to hold back tears, and the little girl laughed, a bright and crystalline sound, then called out, "Mommy," in her sweet, childish voice. Faye swept her daughter into her arms, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks beyond all control, because the moment for which she had sacrificed her youth, her private dreams, and so many long nights of exhausting struggle had finally arrived, and it was sweeter than anything she had ever imagined. Standing silently in the doorway, Rafferty witnessed that sacred moment between mother and daughter, and the man who had once believed his heart had long since hardened, felt his eyes burn with emotion, because he understood that he had just witnessed the most beautiful gift life could offer. From that day forward, Faye's life entered an entirely new chapter. She no longer had to struggle over every dollar or accept work that drained every ounce of strength from her during endless nights. But neither did she become a woman who lived by depending upon another person's generosity, because that had never been who she was. Instead, she accepted a position with a charitable foundation Rafferty had established, an organization dedicated to helping struggling families and disadvantaged children like those she and her daughter had once been. Because of everything she had endured, Faye brought to that work an understanding and compassion no amount of money could purchase. She understood the suffering of those who had no power or voice because she had once been one of them, and she devoted her whole heart to the work, becoming a warm bridge between hands, reaching out for help and opportunities those people had believed would forever remain beyond their grasp. That work restored to her what she had always desired most, not wealth, but the dignity of living a useful life, of standing upon her own 2 feet and bringing goodness into the lives of others. And during those peaceful months, the feelings that had quietly begun to grow between her and Rafferty also blossomed naturally, as though following the simple rhythm of life itself. There were no elaborate declarations of love and no grand displays. Only 2 people who had suffered deeply and slowly found in each other a peaceful place to return to, a profound understanding they both knew was rare in this world. As for Celeste, after everything that had happened, she still learned nothing from it. People said she left the city for some distant place, and before long, she became entangled in another arranged marriage with a powerful family, continuing to live the empty and glittering life to which she had grown accustomed, still believing that a person's worth was measured by status and wealth rather than kindness. She never understood that her own arrogance and cruelty had driven her away from what she might once have possessed, and she continued along her path, never realizing that what she had lost was far more precious than everything she still held. But Faye no longer cared about that woman, because her own life was now filled with light, and she had learned that the sweetest revenge against those who had once trampled upon her was to live a life far happier and kinder than theirs could ever be. Many years later, When Josie had grown into a radiant young woman who could hear the morning birds singing and the laughter of children playing outside, there was still one object displayed with honor inside a small glass frame in her home. The paper boat yellowed by time, bearing the crooked words written so many years before. "Don't be afraid of the dark." That little boat had survived for more than 25 years. It had crossed the darkest nights of an orphaned boy and the most difficult days of a single mother, until at last it came safely to rest in a home filled with love, becoming a quiet reminder to the entire family of a truth both simple and profound, that even the smallest act of kindness, offered by a child who possesses nothing, can become a lighthouse, guiding someone through an entire lifetime. And after many long years, can return to warm the very heart that first gave it away. The story of Faye and Rafferty reminds us that a person's true worth has never been found in the clothes they wear, the position they hold, or the fortune they possess, but in the way they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. It reminds us that kindness given without conditions is never meaningless, because even though it may take many years, it will still find its way back to us in ways we could never imagine. Above all, it reminds us never to look down upon the quiet people around us, those who carry trays and pour drinks, those who clean the hallways, those who work silently each day in hidden corners where few people ever bother to look, because behind an ordinary appearance may live a noble soul and a story that would make us bow our heads in admiration. True dignity is never defined by status or stripped away by cruelty. It is the quiet light we choose to keep alive within ourselves, even through the darkest storm. If tonight's story has touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to press the like button and share it with the people you love, so that kindness and compassion may continue to spread even farther. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so we can continue listening together to many more meaningful and deeply moving stories shared with you every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please leave a few words in the comments and share the honest thoughts and emotions that come from deep within your heart, because every message you leave is a precious source of encouragement to us, and perhaps it may also touch the heart of someone else who is listening. Thank you for staying with us until the final moments of this story. May everyone listening always be blessed with abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the stories to come.